I'm Daisy Dunn, and my book is Of Gods and Men, 100 Stories from Ancient Greece and Rome, and it's published by Head of Zeus. It's out now. When I was a child, I used to devour books of myths. My favourite story was of Odysseus and the Cyclops, and I remember I had one book which actually had a picture of this inside, and it featured this horrible one-eyed monster clutching one of Odysseus's men and preparing to eat him for dinner. And I was terrified of looking at this page, so I sort of peek in and then slam it shut again immediately afterwards. When I got a little bit older, I was disappointed, I think, really, to realise that so many of these stories, these retellings I'd enjoyed as a child, bore very little resemblance to the actual stories that the Greeks and Romans had written. So what I really wanted to do was to create a book of 100 stories from antiquity as translated from the actual original texts. And I was fascinated to discover how many of the great writers through history have actually turned their hand to translating Greek and Latin. Everyone from W.B. Yeats to Shelley to Louis MacNeice to Ted Hughes, Robert Graves, even Queen Elizabeth I have translated some of these stories. So I was keen to incorporate a lot of their versions in my collection. And with the Cyclops story, I discovered, I think my favourite one of all was the translation by the great novelist Samuel Butler. So I love the drama which he introduced into the story. I'll just read a little bit of it. He was a horrid creature, not like a human being at all, but resembling rather some crag that stands out boldly against the sky on the top of a high mountain. And then there's this awful moment where he comes across Odysseus's men. With a sudden clutch, he gripped up 2 of my men, says Odysseus, and dashed them down upon the ground as though they had been puppies. Their brains were shed upon the ground, and the earth was wet with their blood. Then he tore them limb from limb and supped upon them. He gobbled them up like a lion in the wilderness, flesh, bones, marrow and entrails, without leaving anything uneaten. Odysseus managed to escape from the cave of the Cyclops. A lot of his men, unfortunately, weren't so lucky. But even after that, he had a huge trial in front of him. He had to try and get home to his island of Ithaca. And having arrived there finally, after sort of being 20 years away, he had to persuade his wife, Penelope, that he really was her husband, to come home to her after such a long absence. And I was interested to find that Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Shaw, actually translated the Odyssey in the 1930s. And predictably, he was very, very good at translating a lot of the passages about the adventures of Odysseus. But I was also really impressed by how charmingly he captured some of the more romantic scenes, particularly the reunion between Penelope and Odysseus. So at sea, when Poseidon has swamped a good ship by making her the target of his winds and mighty waves, the sight of land appears wonderfully kind to the few men of her crew who have escaped by swimming. How they swarm ashore from the grey sea, their bodies all crusted with salt spume, but happy for the evil overpast. Just so was she happy to have her husband once more in sight, and clasped in her white arms, which lingered around his neck, unable to let him go. Ancient stories vary between those with high drama and sort of more domestic scenes. And of the latter, I'm particularly keen on a retelling of Aesop's great fable of the town and the country mouse. The Roman poet Horace picked this up in the 1st century BC, and his version was then translated in the 18th century by a writer named Philip Francis. And I love the charm of his translation, if I would just read a little bit of it. A country mouse, as authors tell, of old invited to his cell, a city mouse, and with his best would entertain the courtly guest. Thrifty he was, and full of cares, to make the most of his affairs. Yet in the midst of his frugality, would give a loose to hospitality. In short, he goes and freely fetches whole ears of hoarded oats and vetches, dry grapes and raisins cross his chaps, and dainty bacon but in scraps. If delicacies could invite my squeamish courtier's appetite, who turned his nose at every dish. The Roman poets often reinvented stories from ancient Greece and sort of retold them for their own times. And my all-time favourite poet, Catullus, in the 1st century BC, did precisely that with the Greek myth of Ariadne and Theseus. In this myth, Ariadne, the princess, helps Theseus to navigate the labyrinth which encloses her monstrous half-brother, the Minotaur, so that he can kill him. And she falls in love with Theseus in the process. But unfortunately, Theseus, the supposed hero, then decides to abandon her at dawn and sail away, and she's absolutely heartbroken. And Catullus wrote a very, very moving soliloquy. If I just read a bit, I translated this myself a few years ago. She says, "May no woman now believe a man when he makes a promise. May no woman hope the words of her man are true. While their minds are desirous, desperate to obtain something, they are afraid of swearing nothing. There is nothing they won't promise. But as soon as the lust in their desirous mind is sated, they remember none of their words, have no fear of perjury." How modern that feels. What really comes home when you read stories from a vast collection like this is just how timeless they are. I was keen to incorporate classic tales such as the story of Persephone and the pomegranate seeds, and the Trojan horse, and the tale of the geese on the Capitol in Rome. But I also wanted to incorporate into my collection lesser known tales as well. So, for example, you'll find one about the importance of breast milk, which I can't say is very well known. Very few people read Latin and Greek today, so I think when you read a collection like this, you're full of appreciation for the translators who have kept those stories alive by rendering them in their own tongue and for their own times. And I think it's very much the case that you can dip into a collection like this, and no matter how old you are, you will always find something to surprise you.